Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing with you all the books that I read in January. So I read 10 books in January and a couple of them were 5 stars. So I'm really excited to share these with you. The first book I read of 2018 was The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This is the first book in Holly Black's new series. I was very pleasantly surprised by this book. If you followed my wrap-ups last year, you would know that I read 2 Holly Black books towards the end of the year and I disliked both of them. So I didn't have very high expectations going into this book, but I was just blown away. It was so good. Like, this book is what I was expecting a Holly Black book to be like from everything that I've heard. And this is really the first young adult book that I've read in a long time that I just obsessed over. So basically this book follows Jude, who when she was 7 years old, her parents were murdered and her 2 other sisters were taken by their parents' murderer to live in the high court of the fairy realm. So 10 years after they were taken, Jude really wants to belong in this fairy world. She is human and she idolizes the fairies and wants to be one of them, wants to have a purpose and a place in this world. And so this book is a lot about her trying to attain this power and destiny. On her path to get all of that, she gets swept up in a political war. It takes her places she never imagined. There is just so much going on in this book. I don't even really know how to accurately summarize it, but I think one of the things I loved most about this book is how every single character was very morally gray. No one was the hero, no one was the villain. Everybody had their own ambitions and things that they were trying to attain, and everyone kind of got in the way of somebody else's dream. I really loved Jude, the main character. I related to her so much, especially with her thoughts on humanity, because one of the things that I always find very frustrating in books like this where humans get swept up in a supernatural or fantasy world, they want to stay human. This is particularly on my mind because I'm rewatching The Vampire Diaries, and Elena Gilbert always talks about how she wants to be human, she doesn't want to be a vampire, and I just don't buy it. If I knew there were vampires or any type of supernatural creature, I would be out there right now trying to get somebody to turn me. I really enjoyed Jude's perspective on being human in that she hated it and she really wanted to become a fairy or just become something greater. Also, at the core of this book, we have a very dysfunctional family. Jude and her sisters have now, for the past 10 years, been raised by their parents' murderer. And I just found the complexity of this family dynamic to be very fascinating and one of my favorite parts of this book. I also will say that Holly Black knows how to write fae. I didn't even realize how many different kinds of fae there were, but it's like she just knows all of the fae lore and she put it all into this book and it was amazing. The world building was so rich and you can tell that she knows what she's talking about. So I absolutely loved this book. I ended up giving it 5 out of 5 stars. I cannot wait for the next book because the ending of this book blew my mind. It was so good, so crazy. I can't even. It was just great. So the next book I read was Star Wars: The Cobalt Squadron, and this is by Elizabeth Wein. And this takes place right before the events of The Last Jedi, and it follows Rose and Paige Tuco. I listened to this on audiobook, which if you are going to read this, I would definitely recommend doing that because it is narrated by Kelly Marie Tran, who plays Rose in the movie, so that was just a nice bonus. I really liked learning more about Rose and her sister because specifically her sister, we didn't learn anything about her in The Last Jedi because this isn't a spoiler because it happens in the first minute of the movie, but she dies. And that scene was so emotional to me even though we didn't know who this character was or anything about her. It was just a very impactful scene, so I was really excited to read this book and learn more about her. And this book goes up literally right before that happens in the movie, and the very last scene in this book is Paige and Rose having a conversation, and just knowing what is gonna happen in a couple minutes, that conversation cut me to my core. It was so sad. Overall, I really liked this book. It wasn't anything that I think you need to read, but if you want a little bit more background on them, I would recommend it. I ended up giving it 3 stars. The next book that I read was The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. So this is about a girl named Alice who her and her mother have spent most of her life on the road, and they've always had really bad luck, so that's why they just don't stay places long, because bad luck always seems to catch up with them. And Alice's grandmother was a reclusive author who wrote this book of dark fairy tales that has a really big cult following. And one day Hazel's mother is stolen away by someone from the hinterland, which is the magical world in her grandmother's book. So she gets swept up on this adventure or journey to try to find her mother and figure out what is going on. Okay. I was very excited about this book. I love dark fairy tales. They are my favorite types of stories. So when I heard that this was about a book in which there is a book in it about dark fairy tales, I was all over it. Unfortunately, this book took me over 4 months to read. I started it in, I think, September or October, and I just dreaded picking it up every single time I would try to read it, so I kept putting it off. I just quickly realized it wasn't what I expected or what I wanted it to be. This book was marketed as a fantasy, so I was very confused when it took 2/3 of this book to finally get to the fantastical elements. I mean, I love fantasy, I love dark fairy tale fantasy, so if that is what you are gonna sell me, you better deliver me that dark fairy tale fantasy. But I think my main problem with this book, and the reason why I kept dreading picking it up, was because of how one of the side characters, Finch, was treated. He joins Hazel on this quest to figure out where her mother went and what's going on, because he's a very big fan of her grandmother's book. He is also biracial and the only person of color in this story, and Hazel constantly referred to him as unattractive, constantly brought up his skin color, and there was one scene in particular where they are stopped by a police officer and Hazel is very non-compliant, very disrespectful, and he has to explain to Hazel about racial profiling and how someone who looks like him can't be in a position where they can disrespect police officers, and she's very dismissive of that and brushes him off and tells him that he's rich, so he's privileged and that's not a problem. That really bothered me, and it was at that point that I just didn't want to keep picking up this book. I did end up finishing it this month, finally, and problematic aspects aside, I was just very disappointed, and I ended up giving it 1 star, and that's that. So the next book that I read was Blood and Sand by C.V. Wick. The blurb for this is, "What if Spartacus was a woman?" So that's what this is about. Spartacus is a woman, and it was great. So we have Atia, who was the princess of Thrace and the greatest warrior the kingdom had seen since Sparta. Her people were completely wiped out, and she is now a slave who is gifted to the gladiator Xanthus by his master. So she is basically the slave of a slave. And Xanthius, the gladiator, is the champion of Rome. And Atia and Xanthius form a bond, and there's sparks of a rebellion. It was so action-packed, really great, very political. I'm not the type of person who loves a lot of action scenes in books, but I really enjoyed them in here. I think they were well written, and you could tell the choreography was right. Like, I feel like a lot of times when there's fight scenes, they just don't make logical sense, but these I think made sense, and I could picture them in my mind. Reading this book really felt like I was watching a movie. I could picture everything. I really liked the main character and the love interest, Xanthus. I really liked him. I was worried going into this, since they are slaves, that there would be problems with consent, but consent was very early on established and a topic of conversation, so I really liked that. But yeah, if you're looking for a really good action historical book, I would recommend this one. And I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was a poetry collection, and it was The Witch Doesn't Burn, and this one by Amanda Lovelace. This is her second poetry collection following The Princess Saves Herself in this one. And this comes out in March. I don't really have a lot to say about this poetry collection. I didn't dislike it, but I don't think I liked it as much as her first collection. I definitely think there were more poems in that spoke to me. Next, I read Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds, and this is a book told in verse. And I listened to the audiobook, which was fantastic. It is voiced by Jason Reynolds himself, and I think that he did a really great job. At the end of the audiobook, he even talks about why he wanted to narrate it himself. He said that because it is written in verse, there's a lot of emotions behind certain words that only he would be able to translate, and I think he did a fantastic job with this audiobook. I definitely recommend listening to it. It was only like an hour and a half. It's very easy to just read in like an afternoon. But basically this follows a boy whose brother was just killed in a shooting, and he is on his way to get revenge and kill the man who he believes shot his brother. And he gets into the elevator. The whole book takes place during that elevator ride, so it's just a couple seconds. The elevator stops on every floor, and every time the doors open, somebody from his past who has died comes in and talks to him. I don't want to say anything more. This book was so good. It was so poignant and raw and honest and important, and I gave it 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. The next book I read was Meetcute, which is a young adult anthology with a bunch of authors that is all stories, like romance stories about meet-cutes. I ended up DNFing this anthology. I think in theory, this was a good idea, but in actuality, I just don't think it worked. Every story was about the meeting of a couple. So we would get a little bit of introduction about a character and their life, and then they would meet someone and there would be a little spark of romance, and then boom, the story's over. Every time a story would end, I would get so frustrated and annoyed, and it just started to make me really mad. Just imagine any romance book you've ever read. Now imagine the book ends right when the couple meet each other, and that is what this book is, but over and over and over and over. And I also, just from an editing standpoint, I would be very curious to know why this book opened up on the story that it did. That's one thing I always like to analyze in anthologies, is the order of the stories, because they're not random. There's always a reason for the order. Somebody put the order together. And this book opened up on a story by Katie Cantugno, and it was horrible. The story was basically this girl is at a house party and the cops show up, so she goes upstairs to hide in the bathroom, and her boyfriend is hiding down in the basement. And in the bathroom, there is already a person hiding in there, and it is a guy. So they're kind of stuck together in the bathroom, and they end up making out and cheating on her boyfriend. And I just couldn't understand why the first story opened up on such blatant cheating. It was weird for a romance anthology. I ended up DNFing this because I just wasn't really enjoying any of the stories. Even the ones that were good weren't great. And I got, like I said, I got mad every time they ended. I don't think this was for me at all. The next book that I read was Nevermore, The Trials of Morgan Crow by Jessica Townsend. This book. Now, I'm not a very big middle grade reader, but I have read some pretty good middle grade books, and this is quite possibly one of the best that I've read. So we follow this girl named Morgan Crow, who was born on Eventide, which is an unlucky day. So she is a cursed child. And basically what that means is that on her 11th birthday, she is going to die. But all around her, bad things happen, and they're always blamed on her. If her neighbor steps in a puddle with socks, they blame Morgan Crow. If someone's roof collapses, they blame Morgan Crow. She's blamed for every bad thing that happens in this town because she's a cursed child. So she's very much resented by her family and all the people around her. So on the eve of her 11th birthday, the day she is been fated to die, she meets a man named Jupiter North, and he whisks her away to a secret magical city called Nevermore. And it is there that she learns that Jupiter has chosen her to compete in a competition of trials to become a member of the very prestigious organization, the Wondrous Society. And so in order to win a place in the Wondrous Society and to be able to stay in Nevermore, Morgan Crow has to complete 4 very dangerous, very difficult trials against tons of other children who are also vying for the same position. And this book was just so good. A lot of it reminded me of the way that I felt when I first read Harry Potter. I really loved all the characters, Morgan Crow, Jupiter North. All the characters were just very wacky and strange, and I loved them. I just absolutely loved this book. It was so good. I think that people who don't necessarily read a lot of middle grade or like middle grade would like this, but it definitely feels like an older middle grade. I ended up giving this 5 stars. It was just so much fun. And then the last 2 books I read in January were Frozen Tides and Crystal Storm by Morgan Rhodes. These are the 4th and 5th books in the Fallen Kingdom series. I was preparing for the last book in the series, Immortal Rain, to come out. But so I was rereading Frozen Tides and then Crystal Storm. So I don't have much to say about either of these because they are 4th and 5th books in a series. I don't want to spoil anything, but I will say that these 2 books definitely cemented Amara as being my favorite character. I love her so much, and it's strange because when she was first introduced into the series, I hated her, but Frozen Tides was definitely a game changer for her because we get her perspective for the first time in this book. But yeah, I cannot wait for the last book to come out. If you haven't already started the series, now is the time to do it because you can binge the entire thing. So those were all of the books I read in January. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts on them are. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!